You are listening to E-Radio Show
by Missed Apex. We are elected.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the E-Radio Show. I'm Matt Trumpets, and today's episode is called Methinks Thou Doth Protest Too Much. We are joined today by our wonderful Formula E journalist, and no more underscore, it must be said, Chris, on Motorsports, Stevens. How's it going there, Chris?
It's going great, Matt. I mean, we had quite a controversial race the weekend that kept me up for a very long time, obviously with the Hong Kong event taking place throughout Sunday morning in the early hours here, but then having to stay up to try and wait for the outcome of that protest.
Yes, indeed. We'll get all into that. But first, let's remind everyone we are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind permission of our better halves, bringing you race reviews, news from the paddock, and tech analysis. We live stream our race reviews, so be sure to subscribe to E-Radio Show on YouTube so you get a notification when we go live, so you can join our live chat room as well. So let's not waste time, unlike the actual race, and let's jump right into the utter insanity that was qualifying.
Yeah, of course, a very wet qualifying we ended up having it. Of course, there was all that talk of another wet Formula E race, the potential of it. And yet again, it didn't really happen, did it? But qualifying most certainly was affected by the rain. And I think what we ended up having was, in a sense, different conditions in qualifying between the groups, because it just stopped raining right before the start of qualifying. So I think the track did marginally get better, but I don't think that it stopped the key players being in there, because we saw, the Mahindras and Antonio Felix da Costa and the BMW Andretti at the back of the grid, and they were in Group 1, but so was Lucas Di Grassi, and he made it through to Superpole. So I don't think you can completely blame the track conditions for why we had such a topsy-turvy grid and why we saw both HWA Race Lab cars making it into Superpole. Of course, not Van Dorn's first time in there, but the first for Paffett. But Van Dorn did claim his first pole position in Formula E, and it was a pretty stunning lap. You have to say, he was amazing, and he's stunned in qualifying in so many races this season when the track conditions have varied a little bit. 3 out of 5 times he's been in Superpole. 2 of those times it was in wet conditions. So I think, when you throw him into those scenarios where it just comes down to the driver, he really does shine. Although there's evidence to say that the Venturi powertrain was running really well in these conditions. 3 Venturi-powered cars in the top 6.
Yeah, and that could also be down to setup as well. But it's interesting to me, this is the first time we've seen Paffett do particularly well in qualifying, and it was in these particularly treacherous conditions. I just wonder if maybe they didn't get the setup more right for this kind of mixture than perhaps some of the other teams.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely evidence to suggest that the HWA wasn't as strong in the dry as it was in the wet, because we did see them go backwards in the race. But that I definitely do think that something about the way the Venturi delivers its power made it slightly more drivable, perhaps. And the fact that they do have some very good drivers in those cars, for example. I mean, you have to look at the likes of Roland as well, who ended up P2 on the grid. Again, a mixture of car and driver, both working really, really well. That Nissan Edam's car has such a punch out of the low-speed corners with that dual motor setup. So around this circuit with so many slow corners, especially that tight turn 1 hairpin, which is probably the slowest corner we go to all season, with such a long straight after it as well, that's utterly, utterly crucial. And Roland himself has been amazing. He's proved that, Mexico wasn't just a one-off. He is probably now, you would say, a regular beater of the Formula E king, Sebastian Buemi.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that conclusion based on this season. And it's interesting. I do wonder if the mixed conditions reduced the power sensitivity of the track somewhat, and that may have given an advantage to some of the teams that we saw more up to the front, in that they perhaps are more drivable or more usable in the mix, because some of those corners still looked absolutely wet, even when the race started, never mind qualifying.
Well, what I found funny was, the shakedown took place in quite wet conditions as well. And even at 110 kilowatts of power, they were still getting very Larry and tail happy. So I couldn't imagine what they were going to be like at 250 kilowatts in qualifying in Super Bowl. And Super Bowl were the worst conditions they had all day, it must be said. That was the wettest it was. So in props to everyone for, keeping out of the barriers. There was really only one incident in qualifying, and that unbelievably was John-Eric Verne repeating history by, backing it across the finish line. But this time, nowhere near in contention for pole. And this time, he did actually crash the car against the barriers, bringing out a red flag, and had his time deleted for it. But even, so he starts 18th on the grid. But even then, with that time he did, he was only going to be 12th. And I'm staggered as to how the likes of Mahindra, BMW, and Verne are suddenly nowhere when they've been the favourites all season. And for DS, I think it was more Verne having an issue. He has commented on the handling of the car not quite being where he wants it to be. And I think Lotterer is handling it a little bit better. But for both BMWs and for both Mahindras to be way down the order, that to me says something is wrong with either the car setup or the way the powertrain delivers that power.
Yeah, and so again, it very much comes down, I would think, to setup and perhaps people going their own particular way. Because in mix, if the conditions are similar, you expect the team to work from a similar model. But when it's that wet for qualifying, when the conditions are mixed, you're really trying to adjust the car to suit what your driver likes to feel. So if you guess wrong, then you really will be very much out of luck. So Mahindra was nowhere. What about BMW? We've seen hints and signs from them in the past races. Did they too just not have a great qualifying, or was there something else going on?
I think it was just that they didn't have the pace. I mean, Antonio Felix da Costa was 20th on the grid. Alexander Sims didn't manage much better. And I will say, those cars in particular looked the most wayward. They looked like they were struggling the most for rear grip. In terms of the front end, and everyone's really struggling for front tire temperature in those conditions as well. I know the third generation Michelin tire is supposed to be better for warm up than the previous generation. That was one of the biggest complaints about it. But in those conditions, where it's really cold and the rain is just making things even harder, it's quite easy to build up rear tire temperature. All you have to do is slam your right foot down. But to build the front tire temperature is a little bit harder, especially when you consider these tight restrictions on brake usage on your in and out lap. So it's not even like you can just keep pumping the brake pedal, which then builds up the temperature in the brake, which then bleeds into the tire. So that is less of an option now than what it was, say, last season.
All right, well, shall we get into the race and where it was won and lost?
100%. Was to start off with Sam Bird. Epic start. 7th to 4th before turn 1. And then he works his way past Andre Lotterer and Stoffel Van Dorn. The latter is to be expected, in all honesty. And it was actually Ollie Rowland who got the jump at the start. And it was setting up to be a really close scrap between those guys until a little nudge from Bird made Rowland accidentally hit his full course yellow speed limiter coming out of the hairpin. So he's just suddenly going nowhere out of turn 1 and the whole field flies by him. So that drops him down to 10th place, unfortunately. And then the top two, Bird and Lotterer, just fly off into the distance, like a second a lap quicker than the rest of the field. And I think that was, again, to be expected, given that Van Dorn was the car in third at the time. And I don't think there was much of an expectation for HWA to maintain those grid positions, in all honesty. Because their car was more set up for the wet, So they lacked a little bit of pace in the dry compared to qualifying. But also just because that car was never going to be as quick in the race, regardless of the conditions, I think, because they're still learning how to run a proper race. And you got to say, this is their first competitive finish, and yet it was in the wrong kind of conditions. So as far as learning anything goes, they're still so limited. But for the top two, it just gave them the opportunity to just completely drive away. And this was quite a weird race because it was pretty much flat out, regardless of, the three safety car periods we had, or maybe including the red flag as well. That was going to be a flat out race, pretty much. It is the shortest race ever in Formula E. That's the benefit of going to a timed format rather than the distance that we used to do. But also because it's such a low speed circuit, there's really only one or two places where you get up to any kind of speed. The rest of it is all pretty slow. You don't build up much momentum anywhere. So in terms of energy use, this is actually pretty low. And I think that's why we saw the likes of Venturi, for example, sticking in there in the race. Not so much HWA running the same powertrain, but Venturi in particular. And perhaps why, the likes of Neo can go and pick up a couple of points, because it was very much a race of attrition. But we'll get into that later. Crucial error from Sam Bird, which we don't often see, it has to be said, where he relinquished the lead to Lotterer. And that, to me, was a very key defining moment of the race, because he spent the vast majority of the rest of that race staring at the back of that DS Techeetah car, ultimately building up to that controversial moment on the penultimate lap, where he nudged the back end of Lotterer's car into turn 2, having attempted a little move, and Lotterer picks up a puncture because of it. And it was such a big moment in the race. It didn't feel like a lot of the time, because it took a while for the aftermath to become clear. I mean, he got halfway around the lap before that tire eventually let go. Although you can see, having watched it back, there was very much evidence of it. If you knew what you were looking for, you could see Lotterer suddenly is squirming around a lot more through the chicane and through that turn 5 right-hander, until ultimately he gets through, turn 6 and 7, and it properly goes bang. So quite a big moment, you'd have to say. And my heart does go out to Andre. He had that race won, but it led to all kinds of drama after the race.
All right, so I've watched it back a few times. You've watched it back a few times. You've had a chance to tweet opinions and delete them.
I mean, I don't do that very often. It was not because I changed my. It wasn't because I changed my opinion on it.
Okay, all right. I'm just gonna give you a little gentle nudge there because I can. But honestly, now that you've sat on it a few days, what do you make of that penalty? Was it the right penalty? And there seems to be this increasing discussion of the driving standard in Formula E that, I'll be honest, I've never heard before. So where is this all coming from? Where is this all leading us to?
There's really so little precedent for this. This, as far as racing incidents go, this is about as on the cusp as I have ever come across, I think. It was so tight between it just being a racing incident and it being worthy of a penalty. Because at the end of the day, Bird's movements took Lotterer out of the race and cost him a win. But then if you give Bird a penalty for that, when he made very, very similar moves 5 or 6 times earlier in the race with no consequence, suddenly then you're giving out a penalty for the consequence rather than the action. Is that the right course of action? And the two teams naturally disagree on the matter. Bird was given a 5-second time penalty that dropped him down to 6th place. But after the race, Techeetah protested that penalty, saying it wasn't harsh enough. And excuse me if you do hear paper rustling in the background, but I have had to make quite comprehensive notes on this that I can't memorize. So Pedro de la Rosa, the driver representative for Techeetah, presented this argument to the stewards, saying that the penalty was not harsh enough, that Bird touched Lotterer several times before that final bit of contact, that Lotterer's defense was consistent, and that, you know, he as a race leader has the right to dictate the line. It was a heavy impact that then caused a puncture. And they also referred to a penalty that Jean-Eric Verne got earlier in the race for contact with Tom Dillman. Now, that was a much lighter piece of contact that both drivers were able to continue from. And so by comparison, it was the same penalty, but the incidents are way out of proportion with each other. And they argue that it sets the wrong precedent for racing. And this is a team that is already rather concerned with the direction that wheel-to-wheel combat in Formula E is going. And I have to say, I kind of agree with them on it, because we've seen a lot of wheel rubbing and a lot of carbon fiber going around in the air. Before, it didn't have much of an impact, but now you're kind of down to a much more aerodynamically sensitive car in terms of efficiency. Because before, it didn't really matter if you lost a bit of your front fender or whatever, but bodywork damage on certain parts of the car now has such a big impact. And Lotterer did get rather unlucky in the contact he had, you know, giving him a puncture. Maybe they do need to cover up the rear tires again, because of course on the old car they had sort of rear fenders, which they don't anymore. So that was Techeetah's argument. Leon Price, the team manager of Envision Virgin Racing, responded, saying that there was mutual respect between the two drivers, but disagreed about the number of times contact was made between them, that Bird had a slipstream and that he was close enough for a move, and that Lotterer moved under braking, which you can't really deny. But again, as a race leader, you know, he can dictate that line. I'm sure Bradley Philpott, if he's listening, will be screaming at me right now for saying that, because he rather disagrees with that movement. He would argue that by doing so, you're just putting yourself in danger. And to be fair, you know, that is true. That's the risk you take. There were other arguments as well, that Bird didn't want to move any further to the right. I saw this in the comments quite a lot on social media. Why didn't Bird just move over to the right a little bit more? That was very, very damp on that side of the track. And had he gone on there, they might have ended up having an even bigger collision. And that this is the interesting part from Price's argument, that the consequence of an incident should not be a factor in giving the penalty, which of course Techeetah then disagreed with subsequently. But ultimately, because no new evidence can be provided to suggest that the penalty should be harder, it was ultimately dismissed.
Right. Well, I definitely have my own thoughts about that. And having watched it back carefully, what struck me was the following things: that Bird was locked up. His fronts were locked up before contact was made. Bird took up the inside position well before Lotterer did. And I think what happened, if I was going to guess from a driving point of view, either one of two scenarios. Either Lotterer was driving the middle to keep him from coming either side, and chose to go inside to make the next turn, and didn't realize that the overlap was already there. So in essence, his rear tire, and it wasn't a big move over, it must be said. It wasn't a lot.
No, it was very gradual as well. I get consistent with what he'd been doing for laps and laps previously.
And so Bird locked it up in an effort to avoid, but wasn't going to go further inside, because I assume there was a reason, but you're saying it was that damp. It makes perfect sense. He would have lost control and taken them both out.
Exactly.
And it was just bad luck that of all the parts of the car that happened to hit his nose, it was his rear tire, and that chewed through his nose and caused the puncture. But what I don't know, and what I would have been very interested in, would be to see an onboard from Lotterer to see if he was watching his mirrors, because if he saw Bird there and made that move in response to where Bird was, then I would be inclined to say that that should be no penalty at all.
The thing is, I think it was a mistake from Bird. I think we can kind of all agree on that. That ultimately won him a race.
I don't
And
know. I
I
don't know if
don't.
it's a mistake though. I mean, to me, and having watched Bird through that turn and watched Lauderer through that turn throughout the race, it looked like to me there was sort of an inside line and an outside line you could take to that apex. And Bird went outside, came back inside, and it looked very much like he expected Andre to go outside, and he wanted to be able to get a little bit of a run on him, have a little bit of room to accelerate into that corner, carry a little more momentum. And I think Andre either didn't know there was an overlap or saw him and was trying to squeeze him. And that's where the contact came from. If he didn't see him or didn't know he was there, he has the right to take up after his defensive move, if we're going by Formula One rules, the racing line. But in Bradley's system, Bird was already there. And now here's the thing we haven't talked about at all, which is the basic design of the car makes it impossible for the drivers to have an adequate idea where the nose is in relation to the car in front of them. How many broken nose cameras did we see after lap number 1?
Yeah, I think that's more down to the circuit design more than anything else, to be honest. I mean, when I was talking to drivers at the beginning of the season and asking them, do you think circuits now need to change in order to suit the Gen 2 car? The two circuits that came up the most were Paris and Hong Kong. And I totally see why. It's not suitable anymore. It's way too tight. It's way too narrow. Like, it was hard enough to overtake there with the old car. But when you add in the fact that this was pretty much a flat out race, which drivers have been complaining about all season, has decreased the opportunities to overtake. So there is a multitude of factors in this outside of the incident itself that are now going to be discussed, I think, in terms of circuit design, in terms of approaching Formula E distances now. I think what we've ended up doing is misjudging how much a race takes out of the new battery, how much energy you actually go through, because this is the second race in a row where we've gone into it thinking, yeah, we're not really tight on energy anymore. You know, we can afford to pick up the pace. And if we have a full caution period or a safety car, then yeah, we're definitely flat out to the end, which is not what you really need, because you need that element of strategy to bring in the overtakes. So drivers are now getting to a point where they need to get their elbows out in order to make an overtake happen. We saw it countless times during that race in particular. That's just what the formula has become a little bit. And because of that, the stewards are taking a much more relaxed approach to these racing incidents. I mean, I saw so many incidents in previous races that just went totally unpunished. The Mitch Evans and John Eric Verne incident in Mexico would be a prime example. Clatters straight into the back of him, no penalty. And this is what staggers me, because we've had such, on the face of it, it seems inconsistent penalty being handed out, because the Sims incident in Santiago, where he was denied the podium, I made my feelings on the show very, very clear that I thought that was an incredibly harsh penalty. And yet we have seen far worse incidents go unpunished, and much smoother incidents, less severe incidents, get heavier penalties. We have gotten to the point where drivers don't know what the consequences of their actions are going to be. And if that keeps up, they're just not going to go for an overtaking maneuver anymore. There's got to be some changes. We need to clean up the circuits and make them better for overtaking. We need to, I think, work on the bodywork of the car a little bit to make it a little bit less sensitive. Now, changes are due to be coming in season 7 for the Gen 2 car, sort of a 2.1 car, with some minor changes like we saw with the new front wings with the old car that came in season 3. And I think we need to tidy up the rules on racing. What is acceptable? What is not acceptable? Are we going to start handing out penalties for the consequences of incidents rather than the incidents themselves? If you do the latter, you are going to kill racing in Formula E.
Okay, so interestingly, you bring up the effect of being able to run flat out on strategy. It's devolved solely into gladiatorial combat, the element of energy management and saving up your energy and deploying it. But I'm going to ask you a related question. We had three, I think, safety cars in this race, and it was immediately apparent that the preferred strategy for everybody was to take their attack mode under the safety car. Is this going to be a potential regulation change that we see coming so that cars aren't allowed to do that?
I'm amazed that they didn't foresee it, to be honest, because that's another great way to kill racing, is to just have everyone take attack mode at the same time. So everyone is, I mean, there were one or two exceptions to the rule. But even with that, I don't think the guys who didn't take attack mode actually lost anything. I think maybe App dropped one position. He was one of the few who didn't take attack mode at the same time as everyone else, and he maybe dropped one position that he can then just take back whenever he wants. Because the thing, even with that extra 25 kilowatts of power, it's so hard to overtake around that track. It is so hard because you can barely even make it around turn one if you're taking the proper racing line, let alone if you're trying to pass someone. And then you just have a concertina effect around the rest of the circuit where it becomes so difficult to pass. I am staggered that you can take attack mode under a safety car. I brought it up, like, I think maybe after the first or second race where we have seen guys doing it. I don't know why it's still a rule. They should change that rule, because it just means everyone ends up on the same strategy. If we actually had some strategy variation with the attack mode, maybe we would have seen a bit of a race and maybe this incident would have been avoided.
Right. Well, let me bring up one of your more brilliant defenders there. You mentioned a few people not being on attack mode, and one of those people was Ido Mortaro at the end of the race. And he did quite a brilliant job defending against the people behind him who did have attack mode.
Yeah, again, I mean, it is close because it is a tough circuit to overtake on. It really is. But you know, at this point, you are speculating because, yeah, maybe the fight up front would have changed. It definitely would have put some distance between them at one point or another, because I can't imagine they would have taken it at the same time. But it is way too hard to overtake around that track. And if some things that have been reported are to be believed, I think some of the local authorities, the local council, reported that despite some rumors, the Hong Kong E-Prix is going to come back and they're going to make some changes to the circuit. I wish I could remember what site I saw that online, but it was some local reporter who said that. So hopefully that is the case, because it does need to change.
Well, I hope so, because it's a great city to go to. And so we've got Bird kicked off the podium. Who wound up winning the race? Tell me. I mean, you've told us how the race is won and lost, but you haven't told us who won and lost it. So go ahead.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on how the race was lost.
Yeah, well, we spent a lot of time arguing about Bird's penalty too, because let's face it, I will say the battle for first and second was really riveting this time around.
It was a really, really good scrap, like up until that moment, and I kind of ruined the race for me a little bit, and it was really, really good, but all to the benefit of Eduardo Mortara and Venturi. Redemption for what happened at the last race when he was leading until like 3 laps to go and he spun and lost the lead. How he managed to do it, I mean, defensive driving, super hard to overtake. So I will say, you know, he definitely did make up places, because he was starting 6th rather than 3rd, because he picked up a penalty in qualifying for overspeeding under the red flag in qualifying brought out by Verne. So ultimately, you know, he would have been 3rd and maybe would have been even closer on this fight. But you know, I think once you got those guys who make it past Van Dorn, you're suddenly with guys that are on very similar pace. But I do wonder, you know, if we had this circumstance on a different circuit, whether Degrassi, Fraint, Apt would have made it past him, because as you know, as much as Venturi was quick in Santiago and how they really did pick up the pieces of a lot of people's misfortune in Mexico City. The same has to be said here. But that qualifying performance did really help them, because as I mean, it's really hard to overtake. Getting the grid position is everything, and without that, he wouldn't have passed, France, Degrassi on the circuit. So keeping ahead of them was really, really important. And yeah, like I don't think Venturi are in denial about it. This has come out of luck. And it's rather unfortunate for them because, it's their first Formula E win. It's Edo's first Formula E win, and they didn't get to stand on the podium, on the top step of the podium for it, which is a bit of a shame for them, really. But I mean, can't take anything away from them. Their car was really, really good in qualifying where it mattered. And they drove a brilliant defensive race and, crucially, kept it clean. And that's the name of the game in Formula E at the moment.
Yeah, it really is. But it also has to be said, Susie Wolf, perhaps showing any detractors that the team has got itself together, because it didn't seem to be making a huge impact towards the end of the last season. And they always seem to be sort of there or thereabouts. They're always in the mix, and it just seems to be they're using resource in a very clever and efficient way.
It's staggering where I compare where they were in testing and in the first two races, where the car kept breaking down and it was slow and they could barely get any laps out of it. Once they tried to do long runs, it just conked out. And we saw, both the HWAs really having issues with it. They were having brake issues as well. The Venturis at the beginning of the season, there were so many problems with that car. And then suddenly they rocked up in Santiago and it was the fourth quickest car. And you will say, there were two races of extremes in Santiago and Mexico. And this is another one, for very different reasons, it will be said. But it is staggering where they've come. No one expected them to be in contention for podiums this season in particular, because there was a big worry that, everyone's been putting all the resource into season 5. That's probably just going to give a big advantage to the manufacturers. The bigger Venturi is, of course, a manufacturer in Formula E, but the major OEMs of Audi and Nissan and the likes, even Mahindra as well. So there's a big worry about that for Venturi to come in, who are the biggest littlest team. It's amazing for them. It really is. And we've kept up this run of 5 different guys on pole position, 5 different drivers winning the race, 5 different teams winning the race as well. I thought the 4th place in Santiago was pretty impressive. The podium in Mexico, even more. But a win, man, that's just amazing for them. And I think we're all pretty astounded that they've managed to put themselves in such a position. But fair play to them, because it is rather astonishing.
Yeah, they've got quite a good crew. So what else do we want to talk about? How about our Formula One alumni? How did they manage this race? Now, I know Van Dorn on pole, that would have been points. And by the way, is it just me, or is Formula One literally talking about and or stealing Formula E ideas openly at this, well, if you'll forgive me, point?
Yeah, except doing it wrong, aren't they?
Yes.
Just like usual. Yeah, so, man, I've just praised the Venturi powertrain, but unfortunately in the HWA, it is still causing them problems, because both drivers suffered a drive shaft failure at some point in the day. Fortunately, Paffett suffered his in practice. Van Dorn suffered his in the race, costing them what I think could have been a top 5 finish. Which is just, again, like, how much more bad luck can Stoffel Van Dorn get? And like I mentioned earlier, no one expected him to maintain a leading or podium place in that race, but there was something to be gained there, I think. But in Paffett, they did score their first racing points of the season, the first top 10 finish. So that's great for them. You know, they've got the ball rolling in terms of that now, and actually have jumped Dragon and Neo, I think, in the drivers in the team standings, I should say. So you know, up into 8th now. That's really, really great for them, because you know we've all been saying that if they don't come last by a long margin, that will be a big win for them at the end of the season. You know, comparing it to say Jaguars' first season, which is the only other reference we have for a new team, even though they are under very different conditions and circumstances. So. Good race for them. I don't think a whole lot learned, unfortunately, just because of the conditions that they were racing in. But it does yet again show signs of positivity for HWA and for Van Dorn fans who keep voting for him in the fan boost, and he never gets to use it. And even when he did use it, he got penalized for it in Mexico. Oh, he does get a lot of bad luck, doesn't he? Poor Stoffel. Felipe Massa, another Venturi power car. Best finish in 5th place, despite having suspension damage from contact earlier in the race. They were very lucky with the red flag. They were able to fix that. Again, I always debate with myself about whether you should be able to fix a car under red flag conditions. It's the very first motorsport article I ever wrote, was about the red flag conditions of the 2011 Monaco Grand Prix that let Vettel win the race effectively. But for Massa, it was very, very fortunate because otherwise he wouldn't have scored his best Formula E finish to date. And I think the big one we're going to end up talking about here is Pascal Wehrlein out in the red flag inducing incident. Basically, Felipe Nasr had contact from the start. Front wing was trapped under the front wheels. So he goes up into the wall at turn 2. And both Mahindras out actually because of that, and that's rather affected the championship. But we'll get onto the standings a little bit later. But that wraps it up for the F1 alumni.
All right, then. So before we do get onto the proper championship standings, are there any other odds and ends, bits and bobs that you would like to pick up before we get there?
Yeah, so we haven't talked about the rest of the podium. Lucas di Grassi, P2, probably felt that there was more on offer. But as we mentioned, Hong Kong, very difficult to pass on. So qualifying pretty much dictated that one. Robin Freint's probably in a similar position, but second podium of the season. And actually is probably the most consistent driver of the season, apart from Mitch Evans, maybe. So, yeah, that's keeping him in the hunt. Paffat, ultimately P8, as we mentioned. Oliver Turvey, more points for Neo, P9. Race of attrition, I think that's most of it. But again, you need to be in that position. And you'd say, you know, Dragon are their main rivals this season, and Dragon weren't in that position to come and score some points when there were only 14 finishes. So, yeah, well done, Neo. Antonio Felix da Costa recovers to 10th. So he ends up scoring a point after his abysmal qualifying. And again, he just couldn't make up ground. Like John-Eric Verne. Didn't go anywhere. 5-second time penalty for Dillman contact, as we mentioned. And then a 10-second stop and go penalty for cutting the chicane and not stopping. And I don't understand why we keep coming back to it. It was a request of the teams to give a harsher penalty for cutting chicanes and not coming to a complete stop and getting going again. And yet we've seen that same penalty handed out, you know, 2 or 3 times in the last 3 races. So I don't know what's going on there. I mean, he even ran off at turn 1 as well. And I don't understand what is going on with John-Eric Verne at the moment.
Well, I don't know what's going on with him, but as far as the teams go, what they meant to say was any team that's not my team should be forced to stop if they cut the chicane because they're going to get ahead of my driver. And that's always where that comes from. They're afraid it will be taken advantage of. But honestly, it looked to me like the opening they had to squeeze through was barely wider than the car. I didn't see anyone go faster through that chicane than what looked like about 10 or 20 miles an hour. I don't know how anyone could have made up time cutting the chicane, but having to go that slow just to navigate it.
No, I think the trouble is that chicane is super slow anyway.
Yeah.
The distance you take around it, like it's always going to be an advantage cutting it. So the rule that you have to come to a complete stop is a right one, I feel. And you know, I'm going to talk about John Eric Verne for a moment because
Okay.
I was optimistic after Mexico that, you know, that he can still turn this around and mount a championship, but that hope is diminishing with every race. You know, he's scored great in the first race and hasn't, but even then didn't meet the potential and hasn't gotten anywhere near it since. And this one is going to sting for Jev in particular, I think, because Andre should have won the race, and yet he was languishing, unable to make up ground, well away from the points, and not able to make up the ground. Odd race for John Eric Verne, and I get the sense that he's growing impatient.
Does it not go back in a sense to his qualifying?
It does. It totally does.
Yeah.
But even then, he was the only one to make a mistake in qualifying like that, to drop it like that, to hit the wall.
Yeah, well, I begin to wonder. There's a new powertrain. There's new brakes. Both of those are and there's a new chassis. There's a new car. So everything that he was such a master of last season has changed to an extent. And when you see a driver with as much talent as he has making mistakes like that, well, I'll tell you, I don't know if you've been watching the Netflix Formula One thing at all. But,
you know I have.
But yeah, I know. It's great, by the way. I highly recommend it, especially if you have family members that are only casual observers. They do a really good job of playing up certain dramas. But I'm thinking of the Grosjean one, where they're like, well, he's incredibly quick. But then, and was it in France? He drops it over the curb, and he's out. And he's out in Q3 before he sets a time, and they're just shaking their heads. And it's that sense that the farther behind you are, the more you're going to push, consciously or not, and the more you push, the more that mistake is going to come find you. It's not just going to happen occasionally, as it does with all good drivers. They're going to start finding you with some regularity the further behind you think you are. It's a very weird mental state I think you have to be in to be behind and not fall afoul of overdriving to some extent to try and make up for it.
I would agree with your term overdriving, but I think that so many of the scenarios that Joe's been put in has been put out of situations out of his control. Mexico and Santiago would be the key ones that I point to. Adiria would be the other one. Marrakesh, he's got no hiding behind that. But I don't think that Jev had too many places to hide in Hong Kong. So I do hope he turns it around because he's a very popular driver, and God knows he is hugely talented and very great in this series. But for whatever reason, it just isn't coming together at the moment.
Yeah, and sometimes it is just that way, and it can be hard to watch those occasions go when you were really blameless. And you mentioned three races out of what we've had 5 so far. So knowing those points were there and having them taken away through no fault of your own, it can mess with your focus and concentration. You wind up pushing, overdriving, trying to make up for it, even though you understand it's not really your fault. But what else are we missing here? A
couple of sad stories, to be honest.
Yeah.
Third consecutive point score in the race for Nissan Edams. Roland retires. I believe it was there was a mechanical issue on the car. They wouldn't specify, but to me that yells powertrain. And Buemi retired. And by the way, shame for Roland again because he's showing leading pace again, and doesn't get the result he deserves. Buemi, meanwhile, suspension damage. and not from contact with Robin Fraintz, as I think was initially suspected. There was actually no contact between those two cars. But it's another what could have been scenario for Nissan, because they were quick this weekend, especially with Roland. So more potential there. Alex Sims, I was quite positive about him in our preview show, and it wasn't to be. After that very poor qualifying, he retired after hitting the wall. PK barely even got going. Lap 1 contact and retired straight away. So the be all and end all of that, amazingly, is that Bird still leads this championship by 1 point over Jerome D'Ambrosio. There is currently 11 points between him, D'Ambrosio, Degrassi, Mortara, of all people, Da Costa, and Fraintz. And I got to say, none of them have been very consistent. It is night and day compared to last season's championship, for example, where Jev made it on his consistency.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of beautiful for us at home because there's a lot of popular and talented drivers in that pool, and it's probably going to go down to the last races of the season for us to find out who the winner will be if things continue this way, which I have to think, being the first season of the new car, new powertrain, it's for everyone, new batteries, that this delicious inconsistency is going to continue to entertain us throughout the rest of the season.
But I think there are guys who aren't currently in that top 6 that are still championship contenders. Pascal Wehrlein, for one. I very stupidly, I will admit now, kind of wrote him off at the beginning of the season as a championship contender, because I thought, well, he's missing the first race anyway, and it's going to take him a few races to adapt to Formula E. Couldn't have been wronger about that. But the way he's hit the ground running, despite not scoring points in 3 races and only coming 6th, in Mexico, if he nails the next few races, he totally is still a championship contender. It's 24 points down at the moment, but that can easily be turned around. It just takes a couple of bad races and for him to have a couple of great ones, which he can so easily do because he's got the speed. The car is good for him in the right conditions, not the wet ones, as we've seen this weekend. But I think there are still guys who aren't, they don't look like they're in the fight, but they are still in the fight. This is a big championship that is still by no means coming down to 2 or 3 guys. I'm sure by the end of the season it might well do, but there are a lot of horses in this race still. And do you know what it is? It's going to come down to that consistency as well. Any one of these guys start building up some consistency, they're going to walk away with it because everyone else is just up, down, up, down, up, down.
Well, I don't know that any team will be well placed to deliver that consistency, given all the new variables of this season.
Well, what's interesting right now, if you look at it, Envision Virgin are the only guys with 2 horses at the moment. I'm sure if Pascal throws in there, then you'll have 2 Mahindras in there as well. But what we're seeing is the driver really making a difference as well. I mean, you look at it, you've got 1 BMW in there. All right, Alex has been extremely unlucky. But you've got 1 Audi in there, as well. But 3 Audi powered cars, so there's obviously a lot of evidence to suggest that the Audi is very good. But we know the BMW is good as well. We know the Mahindra is very good. We know the Techeetah should be right up there as well. This is not over by a long shot. By a long shot.
Well, excellent. Shall we go to our podium? Right, so I know it's all de rigueur to give out first, second, and third and trophies, but that's not what we do here, is it, Mr. Stevens?
Oh, no, not by a long shot.
No, so tell me, after all of the madness, do you have a thing of the weekend?
Easily Stoffel Van Dorn's pole lap. His first since Super Pole, Super Formula, I should say, way back in 2016. And I got to say, having him and Roland on the front row, it was like the 2015 GP2 season all over again.
Yeah, it was. And it's great to see HWA score some points, get on the board. It was nice to see Paffett in the race and eighth. Granted, the conditions may have favored them a little bit, but still, that's a solid result for a brand new team, and that's got to be a big morale boost for them.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you look at when Jaguar came in, they didn't have any races like that in their first season. They picked up points, yes, through attrition and through crazy conditions, but they never went out and scored a pole position. They never went and fought for a podium. And the consistency that HWA has come in and amazed with, Van Dorn in particular, he comes in, top 5 here, and then nearly got 5th place in Santiago as well, and then again here. If it weren't for the car letting him down, then he would be way further up in the championship.
Yes, well, I'm going to go with, and this was tough for me because I was debating between Venturi, period, and Susie Wolf, really doing a nice job. But I think, honestly, if I'm being honest with myself, Sam Bird's first lap.
Yeah, that's fair. It was textbook.
It was amazing. He just around the outside, and you were like, where was that room? And he just made it happen around that first lap. It was a thing of beauty and such fun to watch. So hopefully we have more, which brings us to our other award, Who Missed the Apex? And I'm afraid to even ask because there are, let's face it, many contenders in this race, but who really missed the apex for you?
Yeah, there are quite a few. It is quite difficult to choose from, unfortunately. And every single one I pick is just going to make me feel bad. But I think in this instance, Dragon, because you had every opportunity to go out and score some points, and they're still just not there, are they? That car really struggles. And, if I were to go back and argue about the different conditions in qualifying groups again, they were out in the same groups as some of the quickest guys, and yet they're still not up there. They're still languishing way behind, and they can't get it together in a race. Major work needs to be going on down there, because you're not going to keep high profile drivers like Jose Maria Lopez, like Felipe Nasr, by fighting for 15th on a good day.
No, you won't. And of course that leaves me to pick up the pieces, which has to be Jean-Eric Verne.
Yeah, that's a fair one, I think.
And we all like him, and none of these are meant to be mean, but yeah, he did not have a stellar weekend, and a lot of that came down to, I honestly think, just getting impatient in traffic. Yeah.
It is worth saying none of these are meant to be mean or snidey, but, we are here to do a bit of a job and say who's done well and who hasn't.
Yep.
And that means you have to be brutally honest at times.
Indeed you do, which brings us to the time for plugging. Where are you? What are you up to? What are you doing?
So you can catch me on Twitter at ChrisOnRacing. Check out Formula Spy for the Formula E news, and we're really ramping up the Formula One coverage with the start of the season just around the corner as well. And of course, it's worth mentioning that on qualifying day for the Australian Grand Prix, the Missed Apex crew is going to be in Milton Keynes at Simply Race Motorsport Simulations for our own sim event, live podcast. We're going to be live streaming the whole event. Do check it out.
That's going to be a brilliant and lovely time that I sadly will not be present for.
Well, I mean, you should have stuck around in the UK longer, shouldn't you, Matt?
Yeah, well, about that trust fund that I lack. As for me, of course, I'm at MattPT55. My wife has a book coming out next week. The lovely and talented Amanda Weaver, The One I Love to Hate on Amazon and your favorite ebook sellers now, ready for pre-order. So go check it out if you're into that sort of thing. And you can always catch me on the Twitters. And don't forget to catch us on Twitter at eRadioShow. And if you're a part of our Missed Apex Slack group, be sure to join the Formula E channel in there as well. And we always love to see new faces. And we're getting a lot of new people joining up for the season. So it's very exciting. And remember, chicks dig heels, wounds cause scars, and glory is a fungible concept under certain philosophical precepts. This has been eRadio Show.